So, what Berkeley's up to in the first part of today's reading is a problem that has persisted in philosophy since Plato, and that is trying to figure out what the relationship is between the universal and the particular, which is to say, the sensible world that we experience is composed of a bunch of particular objects, but the sensible world that we experience is subject to change and decay, and so it doesn't seem as though the world we experience physically can be what is most real. We need some other account of reality to, to help us understand how it is that we can continue to talk about the world and think about the world, even though it is constantly changing. And so Plato famously posited a realm of forms that was supposed to be the most real reality that allowed us to understand how the particulars of this world could be made sense of with reference to a world of universals, concepts, and forms that could help explain how it is that not only we can talk about the world as something that is objective and continues to exist, and also how we can know that it continues to exist. And so the relationship between the universal and the particular has been a problem in philosophy and continues even to this day to be a problem in philosophy, to figure out how it is we can make sense of particular things, individual particular objects like this chapstick, but yet when we are talking to each other, we are not talking about these particular things. We are talking in concepts. Words stand in for concepts, and so it's a difficult problem to try to figure out the relationship between universals and particulars. And philosophers have tried, and Berkeley is kind of beginning today's reading by thinking about where philosophers have gone wrong. And in particular, his target is Locke, as I said in the first video. So he wants to think about what is Locke talking about when Locke is discussing abstract ideas or abstract universal ideas. Locke seems to want to posit, for example, that we can somehow conceive of properties of an object separate from the object that they are properties of. For example, maybe we can conceive of a brown countertop, and that we can somehow conceive of this abstract concept of color, that from the particular object we can conceive of the concept of color, and we abstract from the particulars in order to form that concept. In fact, that's what a concept is somehow. That it is that it describes all of the particular instantiations of color without itself being a particular color itself. And so that's somehow what the concept of color is. And this is one particular idea that Berkeley takes issue with. He wants to say that when we abstract from particulars, we are not conceiving of some abstract idea of color, but in fact, we are conceiving of a particular general idea of color. It's not somehow divorced from the particulars. So when you or I imagine color, we are thinking of a particular color, like brown, yellow, blue, or black. It's not some idea that if you stop to reflect for a moment, and I say, imagine the concept of color. Well, what will appear in your head? Well, it will be a particular color. It will not be some colorless concept, whatever that would mean. And so this is one sort of intuitive example, I think, that Berkeley wants to say when philosophers talk about abstract ideas that exist somehow independent of the particulars. We quickly realize upon reflecting upon what it would mean to reflect on those that that it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Now, there's another kind of abstraction that Berkeley does not deny we can do. We can conceive of the parts of a thing separately. So for example, I can conceive of my head as separate from my body. So when I abstract from my body, so my body contains many parts, it is totally legitimate and perfectly acceptable to say I can conceive of my body separately from, I can conceive of my head separately from the rest of my body. When I go up in my head and I think, I can hold the thought of my head and the thought of my body without my head, and there is no contradiction there. So there's nothing wrong with that kind of abstraction. It's the kind of abstraction that says that somehow we can conceive of the properties of things separate from the things as somehow these abstract concepts that can somehow exist, and we can conceive of them apart from the things that Berkeley has a problem with. And this is where he turns to language. So for this part about language, I want to turn to the notes that I have uploaded to Canvas on Berkeley. In particular, I'm looking at page 3 of the notes here where it says Part 2, Language, Ideas, and General Ideas. So you'll see it says L, and that's referring to Locke. So Locke's view was that using language is somehow the evidence for the fact that we can conceive of these abstract general ideas. That the fact that we speak using these, the fact that we speak and using words somehow implies the existence of these abstract general ideas that Berkeley, we've just seen, has denied exist. But let's look at what Locke. So Locke's view was that, quote, using words implies having general ideas. From this, it follows that men who use language are able to abstract or generalize ideas. So Locke's view was words become general by being made the sign of general ideas. So what that means is, and this is basic to any sort of theory of semiotics, is that you've got the sign and you've got the signified. The signified is the thing itself in the world, and the sign is the language that points to the thing. And so Locke wants to say that words are evidence of abstract general ideas, that when we speak to one another about things like color, for example, that we are talking about an abstract general idea of color, abstracted from any particular instantiations of color. Now, let's look at what Berkeley says here in response to what Locke would say. So Berkeley says, words become general by being made the sign not of an abstract general idea, but of several particular ideas, any one of which it indifferently suggests to the mind. When it is said, for example, quote, and he's referencing here basic sort of scientific or metaphysical principles. Quote, so one example of this that we might, as an example of something we would say, the change of motion is proportional to the impressed force. Or, quote, whatever has extension is divisible. So that second one should be familiar to you from all of the discussion of extended substance when we were talking about Spinoza and Descartes. What is Berkeley is trying to say, when we say these things, what do we actually mean? He says these propositions are to be understood of motion and extension in general. So he's not denying that they have meaning in general, that they don't have to refer to one particular thing out there in the world in particular, that they do have a general meaning. But he is saying it must not follow that they suggest to my thought an idea of motion without a body, or an idea of an abstract general idea of extension. So what does that italicized part there mean? That somehow that I can conceive of a body, or that I can conceive of motion on its own. What would that even mean? So motion as a property of bodies. He's saying that anytime I conceive of motion, I'm going to picture a body moving. There's not some idealized, abstracted version of motion. Or that when I conceive of the concept of extension, it's going to be a particular extended body. It's not going to be extension apart from a body. So again, he's just trying to, if you think about this, and I think it's intuitive, these abstract ideas do not exist. General ideas do exist, but abstract universal ideas don't. But general ones do. And so there's no contradiction to say that when we talk about extension, we are referring to particular extended things. But there's not a contradiction there. It just means that when I'm communicating to you about extension, when I'm communicating using the word extension, I'm not talking about extension separate from the extended thing. It is an extended thing, because what is extension without it being a property of a thing that is extended? So Berkeley is just, concerned here about the extent to which this doctrine of abstract ideas is unintelligible when we actually take a moment to reflect upon what it means when we use language. And he's saying that there's no contradiction to say that language can function generally as a general idea, but as an abstract universal idea, that doesn't make sense. So we can use an example so looking at the notes here, I'm still on page 3. For example, when a geometer draws a line on a blackboard, it is taken to represent all lines, even though that particular line that he has just drawn is itself particular and has particular qualities. Similarly, a particular idea can represent all similar ideas. So the point is, there's nothing, this idea that somehow a particular idea, that somehow in using particular ideas, we are somehow losing, or that we can't have in mind a bunch of similar things in relation to the particular idea, Berkeley doesn't think is true. That the particular, in its particularity, can also function generally. And so we don't need to posit the existence of some kind of realm of forms or concepts that exists separately from the particulars. So there's more to say here, but I hope that you at least get a sense here of what's going on with Berkeley. Berkeley thinks it is this. The reason he spends so much time on this at the beginning of today's reading is he thinks that this doctrine of abstract general ideas that seemingly has been with us since Plato is responsible for a lot of the mistakes philosophers are making when thinking about how we know the world. And so with that said, I want to then move into some of the more particular things about Berkeley, in particular his sort of subsequent to Berkeley, similar with all these other philosophers, he is referred to as, quote, an idealist, which is the position simply that the only things that exist are ideas. And he's also an immaterialist in the sense that he denies the existence of physical objects. Physical objects for Berkeley are simply collections of ideas. So I want to move into that next. So I think one of the keys to understanding Berkeley's claim as an idealist, which is the claim that only ideas exist, is thinking about the picture of knowledge that we have from somebody like Descartes or somebody like Locke in particular. Locke gave us what we might consider a representationalist account of knowledge, which is to say that the way that we have knowledge is that somehow we interact with an object in the world, and then we form an idea of that object. And the idea we have is obviously mediated through our sensory apparatus, but it's one step removed from the object. So we don't have direct access to the object. But what we do have is a representation of the object in our head. And that what we do is we actually have is that the object somehow bears a likeness or has a resemblance to. It represents the object. So the idea represents the object. And so there's a premise there. There's a kind of hidden premise that Locke doesn't really argue for, which is that ideas resemble objects. That somehow the physical, or which is the mental, resembles the physical. And so there is a kind of fit or likeness between the mental and the physical that makes knowledge possible. And this is the premise that Berkeley just fundamentally denies. That there is a difference in kind between the mental and the physical, such that we can't make claims that they are like each other. And so Berkeley basically says the only thing our ideas are like are other ideas. That's what our ideas are like. The idea is like an idea. An idea is not like an object. So Berkeley agrees that sensation and reflection are the sources of our ideas. He agrees with Locke on that account. But what he doesn't agree with, when Locke starts making claims about things like primary qualities, and that somehow our idea of extension is similar to extension in the body, he has no basis to make that kind of claim from an empiricist account without kind of making metaphysical claims. And so Berkeley's claim is that ideas represent ideas, or ideas are like ideas. And therefore, the only things that exist in Berkeley's universe are minds, which know ideas, and ideas themselves. And there's also God, who is responsible for knowing, or God who is responsible for perceiving the universe when human beings are not perceiving it. But I'll leave that out for now. For now, the only two things that exist are ideas and minds. Ideas represent ideas. That is sort of the foundational premise for Berkeley's argument. So when we say, for example, that a table exists, for Berkeley, what it means to say that a table exists is that it is being perceived. We're not saying that it exists. So the metaphysical claim, we might take that as a metaphysical claim that the table exists. But existence means perception for Berkeley. So the epistemology here is assuming primacy, just like it did in Locke. The epistemology is assuming primacy over the metaphysical. So the metaphysical claim is actually being intended as an epistemological claim, which is to say a table exists means it's being perceived. SAS percipi. To be is to be perceived. So that is the most famous thing in Berkeley. So if you're looking here in the notes that I have uploaded for today, I'm on page 4, right? So there's a sense in which we can call Berkeley an idealist, in the sense that he said only that ordinary objects are only collections of ideas which are mind dependent. So an object for Berkeley is simply a collection of ideas. So, for example, what an apple is a collection of all its sensory components. An apple is something that is round and tastes sweet and is solid. Those are all ideas about the apple, but the apple itself is the totality of those ideas. There's no substance out there that is an apple that is independent of those ideas we have of the apple, right? So when Berkeley says, for example, I'm looking here at the notes. So going down at the bottom of the notes on page 5 I'm on now, I'm reading here, if one construes, quote, sensible objects as ideas of sense and ideas as objects of knowledge, then having a real existence distinct from being perceived would require that an object be known, quote, as an idea, and unknown as a thing distinct from being perceived, which is inconsistent. And again, Berkeley wants to say that all of this lies in that doctrine of abstract ideas, that somehow we can conceive of the properties of things independent from the things themselves. And that is the foundational problem that Berkeley is pointing to as responsible for a lot of the errors that philosophers are making. Now, Berkeley will go on then to describe Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and about how it's unintelligible to think of a primary quality as existing separate from a secondary quality, and also Locke's doctrine of the substratum, when Locke said, "I know not what." Now, I'm not going to go through that right now, but what I hope is I've given you enough here that can help you make sense of what's going on with Berkeley, and that you'll take the time to watch this video, or that you've taken the time to watch this video. And I may or may not continue to post these in reference to the rest of our readings for this semester. But again, I hope you're all doing very well and that you're healthy. And I will talk to you soon.